Alrighty, so this is a review by me of the article I was assigned, which is Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder and Risk of Post-Traumatic Stress and Related Disorders, a Prospective Longitudinal Evaluation in U.S. Army Soldiers. It was written by Howlett et al. So, the general problem that was being addressed in this article was the associated risk with getting PTSD or other related stressors for those who have ADHD already. This was a longitudinal study, meaning that the study was conducted over an extended period of time with check ins at designated intervals. Self-reported assessments were conducted at four times. They were T0, T1, T2, and T3. T0 was approximately, 3 months before deployment, leading up to deployment. T1 was 1 month post deployment, T2 was 3 months post deployment, and T3 was 9 months post deployment. Associations between ADHD and PTSD, GAD, suicidal ideation, and MDE, which is major depressive episodes, were examined thoroughly. The participants in the study were U.S. soldiers from different BCTs, that's military verbiage for Brigade Combat Teams. The population was all U.S. soldiers, and past research relied on cross-sectional studies primarily. Um, there was a few similar studies that were done on children with ADHD and that association with traumatic events in the future, but overall the prior studies were few, and this was the um, the first one that was done specifically on this as a longitudinal study. The final sample size down to 4,612. The weighted prevalence of ADHD pre-deployment was 6.1%. The longitudinal design of the study, along with baseline SAQs, which are self-administered questionnaires, were, um, were administered, and there was also follow-up clinical assessments in the form of clinically structured interviews and more questionnaires at the time intervals of T1, T2, and T3. The list of the variables under study was primarily pre-deployment ADHD and post-deployment PTSD. To ensure the accuracy of the study, any respondents who ad- ad- their administrative records had to indicate the treatment of stimulants or any other ADHD specific medications at any time prior to deployment, anytime 3 months prior to deployment. That being said, to account for participants that were lost throughout the study, weighted measures were developed and applied in all of the analysis. Obviously, there were some people who, could not participate in all aspects of the study, so therefore the measures were um, employed to ensure the accuracy of the study. The T0 survey assessed ADHD symptoms during the preceding 6 months using items that were adapted from the self administered Composite International Diagnostic Interview Screening Scales, otherwise known as the CIDI SC. And the findings from this scale and a few others were compared to the clinical interviews to account for ADHD diagnoses. Suicidal ideation was established using an expanded self-report version of the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. And, that being said, all of the methods conducted in this study um, supported the study because each one of these questionnaires or these structured clinical interviews were undoubtedly a necessity in getting accurate findings from this study. I do not believe that the researchers, they definitely, I don't believe that they cut any corners per se, or, this was a very thorough, in-depth study. So, ADHD was strongly associated with increased odds of past month post deployment at T2 or T3 PTSD. So, that being said, the weights adjusted linear regression with adjustments made for socio-demographic characteristics, BCT, the number of prior deployments, childhood maltreatment, deployment stress, deployment acquired TBI, and pre-deployment PTSD showed that the pre-deployment ADHD was positively associated with PTSD symptoms severity, both during and after deployment. After adjusting for pre-deployment MDE as well as demographics and other risk factors, pre-deployment ADHD was also associated with increased odds of past month MDE at the T2 or T3 time interval. Adjusting for After adjusting for pre-deployment MDE as well as demographics and other factors, pre-deployment ADHD was also associated with increased odds of past month MDE at T2 or T3. Pre-deployment ADHD was associated with increased odds of past month GAD at the time of T2 or T3 after making those adjustments. Pre-deployment ADHD was not significantly associated with past month suicidal ideation at T2 or T3, which in itself is significant. ADHD was associated with a higher level of MDE and GAD symptom severity during deployment and after deployment. So, out of the 12 pages or so, about three of them were in the article itself. Uh, Three of them were references. The first one was primarily just the abstract. That left about 8 or 9 pages of actual reading material, and inside those 8 to 9 pages, about three of the pages were taken up with charts, such as this one that I've put here for you. So I thought it was important to be able to offer a visual so you guys can see, um, the significance of the outcomes. So this particular graph right here, which I got directly from the peer-reviewed article, shows the prevalence of post-deployment mental disorders by pre-deployment, which is the T0, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder status. Post-deployment disorders were considered present if diagnostic criteria were met at 3 or 9 months post-deployment, which are those T2 or T3. Between groups, differences were significant for all outcomes, as can be seen here. The black bar represents no ADHD at T0, and the gray bar represents ADHD at T0. So you can just take a second to view that and take that in. So the hypothesis was that pre-deployment ADHD would be strongly associated with post-deployment PTSD. The hypothesis in this study was supported, thankfully, um, accrediting the effective methods that were implemented in the study, and they were able to find some significant correlations. In short, the researchers found that ADHD was associated with a higher level of MDE and GAD symptom severity during deployment and after deployment. The study found a strong correlation between pre-deployment ADHD and post-deployment PTSD, which was not consistent with those previous cross-sectional studies that were similar. Um, again, given that this was a one-of-a-kind longitudinal study, that just because they were not consistent with previous cross-sectional studies does not take away from the findings in any way. It remains unclear if whether treatment of ADHD is protective against PTSD and other disorders. It's a question that is an important topic for future study for sure. Furthermore, investigation of possible mechanistic links between ADHD and PTSD may yield advances in prevention and treatment approaches. Although it has been proposed that stimulant medications could heighten the risk of PTSD by increasing brain norepinephrine and thus strengthening traumatic memories, preclinical and clinical research has suggested that stimulants may have some beneficial effects in individuals who have been exposed to trauma. So, future research is also recommended on this topic as well. That being said, the use of stimulants used for treating ADHD could potentially, as noted, increase the risk of developing PTSD if trauma is incurred. This particular study found evidence for robust associations between pre-deployment ADHD and post-deployment MED and GAD, including incidence of these disorders among soldiers with no lifetime history of MDE and GAD prior to the time of deployment. These findings suggest that individuals with ADHD may exhibit generally decreased resilience in the face of trauma as opposed to specific vulnerability to PTSD. Future research should investigate additional potential sequelae of trauma exposure in individuals with ADHD, including possible worsening of ADHD symptoms and overall functional impairment, as well as factors that differentially predict specific post-deployment symptoms. Some possible limitations of this study were in clinical practice. Childhood ADHD symptoms are typically assessed via parent and teacher reports, whereas adult symptoms are more often assessed via self-report, which raises the concern that retrospective self-report of childhood symptoms and age of onset of the disorder may have limited the accuracy of this study. A final limitation was that the inability to know which individuals were completely stimulant naive. That being said, obviously these particular subjects were not being monitored 24/7, so there may have been instances of self-medication with stimulants that could not have been accounted for and could potentially skew the results in any particular way. And this is the work cited. As I stated previously, this article was written by Howlett et al. Thank you for watching.